Hello, believers. There could be this promise you have from God that practically doesn't look possible to be fulfilled. Welcome to the Marketplace Assembly Bible Study. My name is Barno, and we are looking at the book of Luke. Today, we want to look at divine engineering, or the genius of God in fulfilling his promises. Sometimes you have a promise from God that practically doesn't seem possible to be fulfilled. You have read in the Word that God has promised us healing, God has promised us prosperity, God has promised us good health. But in the situation you are in, when you talk to your bankers, it doesn't look like that is possible. When you talk to the doctor, the promise of God doesn't look to be possible. As we study the book of Luke, we are going to see how God moves in what I call genius moves to fulfill the promises he has given. Surprisingly, the answer to how God fulfills his promises, no matter what, lies in the boring genealogy chapters of the gospel. Today, we are looking at the genealogy of Jesus as recorded in the book of Luke. And it's radically different from the way it is recorded in the book of Matthew. Stay with me for a moment. I know the genealogy part of the gospel books is what we really read, but therein lies the genius move of God in fulfilling promise. You see, in the book of Samuel, God promises David that the throne he has given him, he will give him a heir who will sit on it forever. Not symbolically, not theoretically, but he will sit on it forever. So we can confidently say that in the book of Samuel, God gave David a promise that a descendant of his will sit in his throne forever. Solomon comes, so many other kings come, and somewhere along the way, the descendants of David, who were kings, disappoint God so much that God swore in the book of Jeremiah chapter 22 that none of their hair will ever sit on the seat of David again. Who are these kings? We first see King Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim is a king that does that which does not please God. And God sends Jeremiah to warn him of what he's doing as a prophet. And Jeremiah writes down the warnings from God. And in some way, these warnings from Jeremiah get to the advisors of the king. And the king and the advisors tell the king, there are these things written by Jeremiah that you think you have to read them. So Jehoiakim says, okay, bring him. And every time they finish a scroll, Jehoiakim would ask for it. He was seated at the fireplace. He would cut it into pieces and throw it into the fire. The Bible has got very interesting and funny, actually sad stories. By the time the reading of the warnings from God is done, King Jehoiakim has completed burning the scripts or the scrolls. He is banished, and Jeconiah, his son, comes in. Jeconiah continues on the path of his father. He's one of the kings who reigns for a very short time. But after Jeconiah, God makes a promise to that family, who are the heirs of King David. And God tells Jeconiah in the book of Jeremiah chapter 22 that none of their descendants will ever sit on the throne of David again. So practically, the promise that was given to David by God in Samuel does not seem possible again to be fulfilled. From the story so far, we have seen how practically impossible it is for God to fulfill the promise that he made to David. But the answer lies in a very boring part of the scripture that we rarely read. As you read through the genealogy of Jesus, Luke gives us the answer. You see, the enemy would have thought that I have looked at this. The promise given to David is no longer possible to fulfill. But God says, watch this. Luke traces the birth of Jesus. If you compare, I would want us to compare the genealogy in the book of Matthew and the genealogy in the book of Luke. In the book of Luke, Luke traces the genealogy of Jesus through Mary, who also happens to be the descendant of David, but through Nathan. From Heli, her father, all through to Nathan. Nathan is a son of David through Solomon, actually an actual brother of Solomon, but his blood does not carry the curse that was given to Jeconiah in the book of Jeremiah. So biologically, Jesus is connected to David, but without the connection of the blood of Jeconiah, who God had promised will never sit again on that throne. But you see, the king has to have a legal right. Biologically, he is connected to David. But in terms of the legal right to being a king, in the history or in the culture of the Jews of the first century, you couldn't become a king just because you are connected biologically to a king. You could become a king if that blood or legally you have the right to kingship or to inherit it. And therefore, we see this in the genealogy of Matthew. Matthew follows the crown. And if you look at the genealogy of Jesus through the book of Matthew, you will realize that it goes through Jesus, Joseph, all through to King Solomon. Another perspective that you have to put into perspective about the first century was the legal rights of an adopted child. An adopted child in the first century traditions had more protection actually than a biological child. You see, Jesus is the adopted son of Joseph. And therefore, if Joseph had been a biological father to Jesus, the curse in the blood of Joseph through Jeconiah and to David probably would have challenged this situation. But you see, God, through his divine engineering, works out a way. He brings the biology through Mary and the crown and the legal aspects through Joseph and Jeconiah and Solomon and to King David. The reason I am taking so much time into the history of this is to prove to us that nothing is practically impossible, that no promise made by God is practically impossible. God will always work out a way. God will always work around situations to give you the solution. As you stand on the promise that God has given you, probably you've been trusting God for healing. I want you to be assured of one thing. When God promises, it must come to pass. Probably there is this idea that God gave you in business at the marketplace. Probably there is this promise that God gave you that you will hold this position of leadership in government. And sometimes it looks practically impossible for that to be fulfilled. The answer lies in how God inspires the writers of Matthew and the writers of Luke to go around the whole situation and through divine engineering, through the genius moves of God, fulfill all the legal requirements that Messiah is a son of David, and Messiah has got a legal right to the kingship, so that the promise given to David that a hair of his would sit on the seat is perfectly complete. I assure you, hold on to hope. I assure you, the promise that God has made to you and me will come to pass. The only thing we need to do is trust his genius. Trust that God is outside time. Trust that God is outside any circumstance. That God is not manipulated by time. God can never be manipulated by space nor any circumstance. When he makes a promise, he will ensure that the promise is kept.